Okay, so this week we are looking at public opinion, and I'd like to start by talking about the methodology behind public opinion a little bit. Public opinion in a democracy is fairly important. It is an indication of the idea that in a democracy, the people that are elected officials are supposed to be paying attention to what we think. They're supposed to be concerned about it. But we know that it's sometimes hard for them to figure out what we do think. And so one of the most important ways for politicians, researchers, public policy people to figure out what people want, what they think, is through mass public opinion polls. And this kind of a methodology was only made possible in the 1930s based on the development of probability theory in math departments. And so mass public opinion polling is based on probability theory. And let me just talk about this a little bit. The basic rule is what you see there. If you ask about 1,000 people a question with 2 answers, like for instance, who are you going to vote for president? You can be sure that 95% of the time the correct answer is within plus or minus 3 percentage points of the answer you got. We can think about it as a marble jar, a giant marble jar with 1,000,000 marbles. 600 red, let's say 1,000,000 marbles, and some of them are red and some are blue. And so let's say you start drawing out marbles and you draw out 1,000, and of the 1,000 you find that 600 are red and 400 are blue. That means that 95% of the time you can be pretty sure that the correct answer is between 570,000 and 630,000 red, and a corresponding 370,000 or 430,000 blue. This kind of methodology, of course, doesn't tell you precisely how many there are. The only way you can find that is to actually count them all. But that's very time-consuming, and so if you don't need to know the precise answer, this is a very good time saver, and you can just imagine how powerful this is. All you have to do is ask 1,000 people, and you can be pretty sure about the correct answer. Now, asking more or fewer people does change the sampling error. So, for instance, if you ask around 10,000 people, you could bring the margin of error, the sampling error, down to plus or minus 1%. But asking additional people doesn't bring it down much below 1%. It's very, very difficult to bring the margin of error down any closer than that. And so in political science research, the standard accepted sampling error is plus or minus 3% or 4%. Now, let me just talk about this a little bit more. The sampling error is not based on the percentage of the population you sample. That's why this is such a powerful methodology. So, for instance, look at the 2 possibilities. Ask 100 people out of 10,000, or asking 1,000 people out of 100 million. Those are 2 different surveys. Let's assume in the first one, you ask 1% of the population. In the second one, you're asking 1/100ths of a percent, or 1/1000ths of a percent of the population. But the first survey actually has a much higher sampling error, plus or minus 10%. So if you get, 50-50, if you ask 100 and you get 50-50, the correct answer can range from 40 all the way up to 60. And that's a pretty high margin of error. It's not very useful in most cases. But if you ask 1,000 out of 100 million people, your margin of sampling error is only plus or minus 3 percentage points. So I quite often hear students say, oh, those surveys, they must not be reliable. They don't mean anything because no one's ever asked me or anybody I know. But according to this methodology, you don't need to ask very many people in order to get a pretty good idea of what everybody thinks. This probability theory itself, if you go over to the math department, you can see a proof, step by step that this is correct. So we call these scientific polls. But the correct sampling error is not the only element of a good scientific poll. One, of course, it's also crucial that the people that you ask, that it be random. Okay, so randomness is important. Now, what we mean by that is that if you think of the marble jar, for instance, every marble in the jar has to have an equal chance of being selected. So if you were to deliberately place all the red on the bottom and all the blue on the top, and then start drawing from the top, of course that wouldn't work. You would have to shake your marble jar vigorously to get a random distribution. Now, in real-world surveys, the way that works typically is by using random digit dialing. Now, this is giant databases of all of the landline telephone numbers in the country, and numbers are selected at random. Now, we know that today there's a lot of problems with that approach, and there are lots of ways in which pollsters and researchers are trying to figure out how to solve those problems. One of the biggest problems, of course, is cell phones, and the fact that your demographic doesn't even usually have a landline. Now, the way that pollsters do this is to they do some research and figure out who doesn't have landlines or who tends not to answer the phone, and then they'll weight their responses more heavily in the event that they get replies from them. This is a tough thing to do, delivering randomness like this, but pollsters, good pollsters I should say, spend an awful lot of time trying to make sure that they do that. Let me just show you very quickly a story that I came across recently about some polling information that the New York Times collected. They went out and surveyed 867 people about who they were going to vote for president. And then they took that raw data, who they asked, what their income was, what their race was, gender, part of the country, all this kind of stuff. And then they shared it with 4 different pollsters. And based on that exact same information, those 5 pollsters came up with different answers about who's ahead in the race right now. I just want to show you a couple of those differences, the way that those differences were arrived at. One of the issues was, how do you represent the diversity in the population? So for instance, if you, people that tend to answer landline phones tend to be elderly and more often white. And so you might get a situation in which you have, 80% of the answers are from a white elderly person. So you have to adjust that. And if you're going to adjust it, you have to have some idea about how many answers from white people you need to have and how many answers from Hispanic and Black. And so, for instance, in this survey, you can see the differences between the pollsters ranging from assuming that about 65% of the answers should come from white people to up to 70% of the answers should come from white people. And of course that affects their result. But the pollsters are very clear about how they do this. They're very transparent. It's not a deliberate attempt to modify the data one way or another. They'll have explanations about why they weight the answers the way they do. Another issue is trying to reflect the data based on who's likely to vote. So you'll see some polls that will be published that will say, this is a poll of likely voters, or this is a poll of registered voters. Those are very different kinds of polls. And so if you're going to say that this is a poll of likely voters, which is a much better way of gauging who's actually going to win the election, you have to figure out how to determine if they're likely voters or not. And so you can see that some of the pollsters would allow the respondent to self-report and say, oh, I always vote. A couple of the pollsters, though, will say, well, I'm not going to trust the person to tell me because we know that people will say they're going to vote even though they won't vote. So we're going to go look at the voter history and see how people in their demographic tend to vote, if they vote or not. And the New York Times takes a combination of those two. So I just wanted to show you that as just an example of how it is that pollsters try to get randomness when they do the polls that they report in the press. Now, I'm not saying that all pollsters do it this way. Some polls are pretty bad. They're not scientific. So, for instance, if you've noticed any of the polls that will say, click here and tell me who you thought won the debate last night or whatever. Those are not scientific in any way. They don't reflect this kind of methodology, so that we have to consume those polls in a different way, which is to say that those are not representative samples, but they might be interesting in some way, but just not scientific. Another set of questions has to do with how questions are worded. Are they meaningful? Are they biased? Okay. Let me just show you an example of meaningless questions. You can take a look at this. This is an example of questions that the Gallup organization, which is one of the most highly respected polling organizations in the country, they were thinking about running a poll about healthcare and people's views about the healthcare system. This is back in 1994. And they were doing some research to figure out what questions they should include in their poll. And one of the things they did is they said they took this issue of the healthcare crisis and they worded the question two ways. And the only difference is that they changed the order of the choices between these two questions. And what they found was that that affected the answer in a very strong way, so that people essentially just chose whichever was the first choice. Now, for a pollster, this is a big red flag that says throw this question out is a meaningless question. Anytime that you can change the order of the choices, and by doing that you change the answer, that is a meaningless question and really shouldn't be included in any good poll. And so the organizations like the Gallup organization, the Pew Center, they will go out and do this kind of research before they run any poll that they're going to report in the press, and they'll make sure that this isn't the case. I've heard students many times say, "Oh, those polls don't mean anything. If you just change the answer, change the choices, you'll change the answer." That is not the case with the questions that are on these good polls. That's not to say that some people are not going to answer in ways that are unreliable, and that some people are not going to say they don't know. In this case, I would kind of hope that I would have been among the group of people who said I don't know, because this really is kind of a meaningless question. The other issue is whether the question is worded in a way that is non-biased. Now, I want to illustrate this using some polls around the question of the Iraq War. And you can see these different ways of wording the question here. I want to focus on the ones on this side here. The yellow line here, the way they asked the question was, they said, "Do you agree the results of the war are worth the cost in American lives?" And that got a pretty low, the lowest level of expressed support for the war in Iraq. The black line, all in all, the war was worth the cost. That's in the middle. And then on top, the war, do you agree the war was not a mistake? Now, you can probably, in your mind, pretty quickly surmise why it is that this way of asking the question had a lower level of expressed support than saying that the war was not a mistake. But the issue that I want you to focus on is, what is the right way to ask this question? How do you ask it in a non-biased way? And there really is not a real good answer to that in this case. one could certainly say, well, if you ask it this way, you're going to get less people to say they agree with the war. And the point is that pollsters know that. When they're designing a question, they know that if, in this case, they knew that if they included the word lives and an image of the lives being lost, they would get less support expressed. And if they asked it in terms of the war being a mistake, that they would get more. But this doesn't really tell you which way you should ask the question. It just gives you an idea of what the response is that you're going to get. You could say, well, I'm going to ask it in a way that's going to give me a middle answer or a neutral answer. But that is also a choice. It's a choice not to forefront the question of American lives or the fact that it was maybe a mistake. And so pollsters they're kind of faced with this dilemma about how to ask these questions because they know in advance what it's going to do to the answers. And so what the most important thing for them to do in this kind of a case is to just pick a way of asking it and then be consistent over time and ask it the same way. Every time they ask the question, they ask it exactly the same way. And so what becomes much more important is the trend data over time. What happens to support for the war in Iraq over time? No matter how you ask the question, over time, there is less support expressed. And so sometimes polling organizations, for instance, they'll look around and say, well, how are they asking it? Well, they're using the word lives, so let's not use the word lives. How about we ask it this other way? And there's a lot of that kind of thing that takes place as well. So they're not asking the questions in a vacuum. They certainly understand the effects. Now, so when we think about the questions, right, what's really important is paying attention to trends. And let me just take you to this one here, for instance. You can see that there is no trend. And I'm going to come back to that in just a couple of minutes. But another issue is, when we think about the elements of a good scientific poll, the question of the reliability of respondents is very important. And that's a really, pervasive question. It's a question that's been very important ever since we started doing these polls and realizing that for the most part, citizens do not have a lot of information. They don't know a lot about the political system. They don't know a lot about public policy questions. They might answer a poll a certain way, but they don't really know why they answered a certain way. And so the reliability becomes an important question. And so I want to break this down a little bit and talk about different ways in which pollsters have thought about this recently. Well, one kind of unreliability might be honesty. And I'm not going to spend very much time talking about this, but certainly political correctness leads people to answer questions in certain kinds of ways. So, for instance, asking people, did you vote in the last election? Quite often they'll say yes, when clearly they couldn't have because that many people didn't vote. And sometimes there's a certain percentage of people that will just always joke or lie just to undermine the results of the survey. And pollsters try to estimate how often that is, and then they just, and they also try to understand whether that, 50% of the people will answer it one way and 50% who are lying will answer it another way. Maybe those answers cancel one another out, but at any rate, so this is one set of issues. But another one that's probably more pressing is the question of accuracy and what we call low information voters. And this brings us to a pretty important distinction in public opinion research, and that is between latent and broad public opinion. Now, broad public opinion is, these are opinions that are generally stable over one's life. There are things like political predispositions or values that condition one's views of the issues. They're expressed sometimes in terms of an ideology, like being liberal or conservative, or party affiliation. I'm a Democrat or a Republican, and the Democratic Party thinks this, and the Republican Party thinks that. Sometimes more specific values that they have on a particular public policy issue. That conditions their views of questions. These kinds of public opinions are fairly stable over one's life. Sometimes they are inconsistent, so sometimes people will at the same time say that they favor less government, but they also think that government should spend more money on education and roads and all kinds of other things, Medicare, Medicaid. But this is one kind of public opinion. Let me just give you an example of that, and that's the Gallup ideology chart. This is an important and very simple way of distinguishing between the most important ideological labels that we find in our political system. You should know how to place these 4 labels in these quadrants. It's very important. It's hard. For some of you, this will be very simple. But I find that some students really cannot do this. And if you cannot understand what we mean by conservative or liberal, it's very easy to get lost in political discourse and understand what people are talking about. So the simplest way of doing this is using this Gallup poll of ideology. And one would be asked these 2 questions. First off, which do you agree with more, this or this? Which do you agree with more, this or this? And then based on their combination of answers, they would be placed in one of these little quadrants here. And so your task is going to be to know which label goes in which of these quadrants. Now, the type of ideology that says that government is doing too many things that should be left to individuals and businesses, and also that government should promote traditional values in our society, like, say, sticking with traditional marriage or holding the line against new forms of gender identity, we would call them conservative. And people who would combine that government is doing too many things that should be left to individuals and businesses with an idea that they shouldn't favor any particular set of values, this is what we would refer to as libertarian. And here we have liberal. A liberal is someone who would say, yes, government should do more to solve the country's problems. So, for instance, oh my goodness, look at that. That's a mistake there. Very strange. Can I get that? There we go. Government should do more to solve the country's problems, like, for instance, the healthcare system is a big mess. Government should be helping to solve that, versus government would simply screw it up if they got more involved up here on this level. So liberals take this this confluence. And then here we would place the label of populist. Now, populist here, all we mean is that it's a label that's been used by the Gallup organization since the 1930s to refer to somebody who says government should do more, but also that government should promote traditional values. I know in popular discourse, sometimes populist, so for instance, Trump is referred to as a populist. That's not what we mean here at all. You could call this watermelon if you wanted to, but this is just the label that the Gallup organization uses for that answer. So this is an example of what we call broad public opinion. If someone calls themselves a conservative, this doesn't change very much over their life. We know that the best predictor of somebody's ideology when they're 40 is the ideology that they articulate when they're 20. Now, most people do not choose to identify themselves with an ideology, but to the extent they do, it's very important. Now, where do these public opinions come from? Well, family is very important. We know that. We also know that events can be very important. And events, when we say events, when we're talking about broad public opinion, we mean generational effects, things that happen when one is forming their political identity, generally when they're in their early 20s. And this does not change very much over one's life. And let me show you an example of this that was represented in the press. This is a very interesting study that looked at how one's ideology, when the effects that are taking place when someone is 14 to 24, the things that take place during that time of their life have the strongest effect on what their political views the rest of their life is going to be. So this is a measure of how strong the effects are. And you can see after 40, the effect of events that happen in society is relatively small. So by 24, if you have been in a situation in which it seems that the events that have happened in the world have led you to believe that government should do more to solve the country's problems, that's going to have a much more stronger effect than any other events that happen later in your life. So let me show you a couple of examples from the data. And if you can go back and take a look at this representation in the New York Times. It's pretty interesting. So if somebody's born in 1941, for instance, that's about the time my mom was born, the person who was president when they were in their formative years, so in their early 20s, for instance, late teens, early 20s, was Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was a Republican. He was a very popular Republican. And that the events that took place during those years has an effect on their views the rest of their lives. So they ended up being much more likely to be Republican than anything else, right? Even today, the people who came of age during the Eisenhower years tend to be Republican. It's the same thing with somebody who was born in 1952, so just a few years later. Those people came of age during the late 1960s, early 1970s, and that was also right at the tail end of that is Watergate. But those people tended to be Democratic the rest of their lives. That was the period when JFK was president, during the early years of the Johnson administration. A lot of optimism around civil rights and things like that. And those people tend still to be Democratic. So very interesting. Now, if you, I'm just going to take you up here and show you how you can move through this dynamic here. So if you start with somebody, if they're born in, sorry, let me move it down a little bit. We'll go the other way. So if somebody's born in the 1930s, right, they're coming of age, like I said, during the Eisenhower administration, they tend still to be Republican. That's why we see a lot of elderly people today are still Republican. And then you can see how it moves as we move through the birth ages, the birth years, and the ages they come of age. And you can see that's the Democratic effect right there. And then people who were born in the 1960s tended to be, if they were born in the 1960s, that means that they were in their formative years during the Reagan administration. And those people tend to be Republicans still. So there's a Republican effect during the Reagan years, right? And that continues on. And then by the time we get to people who are coming of age during the Bush years, they tend to be more Democratic. And you can see people, and so that's kind of where we are right now. The people who were 22 in their early 20s during the Obama administration tend to be much more Democratic. And this is worrisome for the Republican Party. We see this trend right now is shifting back to a kind of a Democratic effect right now, generational effect. We also see pretty strong cohort effects in terms of groups. So African Americans tend to be much more Democratic. Evangelical Republicans tend to be more Republican, right? Now, we talked about broad public opinion, but latent public opinion is another form of public opinion. These are opinions that are made up on the spot in response to questions that the people hadn't really thought about before. These are based on what we call considerations. Whatever comes to mind, considerations that come to mind when they're asked a question they haven't really thought about before. These are quite unstable, changing. They're very subject to recent events, things that just happened, maybe even a conversation they had recently with somebody, an interview they saw on TV, or a show they saw recently. Whatever comes to mind, they'll use to answer those kinds of questions. Opinion leaders, and when one is measuring public opinion, it's very important to know if one is measuring latent public opinion, something that somebody just made up an opinion on, or they haven't really thought about it before, and they may have some very strong considerations, like for instance their ideology or whatever, but they've never really thought about it before. Most people, their answers to most public opinion questions are like this. And so the Pew Center typology that you did is an example of a combination between broad public opinion and latent public opinion. So let me just look at that a little bit. The typology that you did, typology assignment, is an example of what we call cluster analysis, and asked questions trying to understand broad public opinion, but many of the questions in the typology survey itself were about public policy questions. The methodology that's used in that is they surveyed about 10,000 people, and they wanted to split up the electorate in a way that was more complicated than the simple 4 quadrants in the ideology chart. And the way they do this is they take all these answers to 10,000 people's answers to many, many questions, and then they divide them, tell the computer, divide these into groups that are about the same size, what we call clusters. And so, for instance, if you got the label of liberal, that's about 40% of the students in my classes this semester are liberal. That matches to 15% of the people who took the survey, or the clustered answers were about 15% clustered in a way that was solid liberals. Now, you can see that almost all these groups are about the same size. Now, this does not necessarily reflect, it does reflect public opinion in general, because it is it's a sound scientific survey, but the groupings themselves are not necessarily based on different recognizable groups. Each group has about the same number of people in it, so that they can maintain a sampling error of about plus or minus 4 or 5%. So the groups can't be too small. So every group has about the same number of people in it. And you can see in our class about 40% liberal. The faith and family left, that's very probably like the populist on the quadrant chart. Next generation left, and these are the Democratic leaning groups, and the Republican leaning groups down here. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about some of these answers later, when some of these groups and the different kinds of answers they give. in the next section where we talk about political parties. I want to come back a little bit later and do that. But I wanted you to, have a sense of what this was, what it was all about, and then we'll come back to it. Now, another way of thinking about the issue of accuracy and reliable respondents, we talked about the difference between latent and broad public opinion, and this is Lupia and McCubbins, that was on the syllabus for this week, is thinking about the difference between information and knowledge, and they are starting from the idea that people don't have to have full information about public policies in order to make reasoned choices. There are lots of things in the world that we go through the world without full information, but we can still reason our way through pretty well. People are rational in their use of information and in their expending of the time and energy that would be needed to collect information. And so in our world, it doesn't pay for every single individual to fully inform themselves about a huge range of policy choices. It just doesn't make any sense. And so many of them try to find shortcuts, and all they need is knowledge in order to do that. That's the ability to predict the consequences of this action. Shortcuts, taking the advice of others on what choice to make, can be a substitute for full information. So for instance, people will look to opinion leaders, people that they agree with, they have found in the past that they agree with on a lot of different things, or they have a lot of respect for them. Sometimes their parents, sometimes a media official, sometimes people in their political party, or on a talk show or something, as a substitute for full information. But of course, this introduces the policy that they're going to be the possibility that they're going to be deceived. What Lupia and McCubbins are looking at is the question about how this deception can be reduced. So they are thinking about how one can clarify the incentives of advice givers, right? People who are going to say, you should think this about this. How do we understand whether they have our interests at heart? And this is really what this piece is about. How do people choose whom to believe? And in that, they are going to be persuaded. They look for people who are both knowledgeable and also trustworthy. So people who are knowledgeable, and these are people who they think have knowledge about consequences of action, even if they don't. So they're trying to find other people who know what this policy is going to mean for them. And they're also looking for people who are trustworthy, and one measure of that is that they are seen to have the same interests, right? Now, one way to think about that is that you can increase the possibility that they're going to be correct about these things if you have external forces like fact-checking or reputational effects, things like that. So for instance, you might know, for instance, if somebody's telling the truth, you can look and see if you can look at a fact checker and see if they're telling the truth. Or if they've been a public figure for 20 years, then they have reputation, and maybe a reputation to uphold, and you can rely that they are going to be doing what they say they're going to be doing. We also see that there is a link between ideology and whether someone thinks somebody is knowledgeable or trustworthy. But what Lupia and McCubbins claim is that ideology is not the first consideration. That for most people, the first consideration is whether they're knowledgeable and trustworthy. And sometimes people see a correlation between ideology and trustworthiness. So, for instance, today we see a lot of people are very skeptical about whether Hillary Clinton can be trusted, for instance. And even though she is articulating policies that might be in line with their ideology, the trustworthiness question has become an issue. And I certainly don't want to give the impression that I am advocating one way or another whether she is trustworthy. But this, from McCubbin's and Lupia's perspective, we can see why this is such an important issue in her campaign. But even given all of this, we still have the question about what to do about people who don't believe facts. And we know, for instance, that ideology and party can shape which facts are believable. So, for instance, there's been a lot of political science research showing that if you present somebody with a public policy choice, for instance, maybe they've never heard of before, they don't know very much about, and you cue them by saying that this is a Democratic proposal, they will favor it if they are Democrats, and they will not like it if they are Republicans. If you give the same policy proposal to people and you cue them and say that it's a Republican proposal, you'll get a reverse effect. Now, that's not the case for people who have high knowledge. But for many people, they are very easily, their willingness to believe facts or to trust public policy choices are affected by the cues that you give them about who is making those proposals. We also know that sometimes people choose the wrong shortcuts, so they believe people who really should not be believed, or they assume that people have their interests at heart when in fact they don't. So these are issues that are not resolvable here, but they're certainly important to keep in mind, and maybe we can come back to them a little bit later. So given all of this, is public opinion meaningful? Well, it's important to say yes, especially when one considers it from the standpoint of trends over time. We also know that public opinion is much more meaningful at the level of society or aggregation rather than at the level of the individual. We know that many, many, many individuals hold opinions which are really inconsistent with one another. But if you kind of stand back and take a view of society, we can see trends over time that are very useful in the public policy realm. It's also important to keep in mind that public opinion polling is much more meaningful if the questions are simple enough that people can know the answers to them, and they don't have to turn to shortcuts or heuristics to find the answers to them. So, for instance, public opinion about how's the economy, how do you think the economy is doing? And people can look to their own lives. Rather than a question about what do you think about the VAT tax? Most people have never heard of the VAT tax before, but they will offer up an answer. And so public opinion polling about the VAT tax is not very reliable unless you take some time to explain to people what it is. We also know that that their answers are much more meaningful if the issue is salient to them. Salient is a measure of how important an issue is to somebody. So for some people, we call them issue publics. Some people are very committed to certain kinds of questions, and polling them is sometimes more meaningful than polling people who have never heard of these questions before. All right, well, that's some issues around public opinion polling, and in the next chapter we'll come back to this in looking at the polarization of public opinion that we've seen recently.